Hi, and welcome to a very special release on the Guitar Historian channel. Today we're going to examine a guitarist whose brief musical career has become the stuff of legend. It is bordered on rock mythology, but who was the man? And why did he turn his back on stardom so suddenly and completely? A deep look at Pink Floyd founder and influential guitarist Syd Barrett, next on Forgotten Fretmasters. Roger Keith Barrett was born in Cambridge, Cambridgeshire on 6 January 1946 to a middle-class family living on 60 Glisson Road. His father, Arthur, was a prominent pathologist and his mother's name was Winifred. Young Roger showed a predilection to the arts from a young age, acquiring a ukulele by the age of 10 and also showing a talent for drawing and writing. He would also play banjo and piano in those preteen years as well. Roger had a generally normal, middle-class upbringing, joining the Abington Scouts troop and ascending to become a troop leader. One of the myriad of stories as to how he got the nickname Syd comes from his time in the troops. The legend goes that he showed up with a flat cap rather than his troop beret. The flat caps, worn by cabbies and generally low-class workers in England, led to the other boys to tease Roger by using the name Syd, which I guess they felt was a name used by the lower class? Who knows? Maybe some of our British viewers can help us out. Another story was that he had the same surname as a local jazz double bass player named Syd, spelled with an I, Barrett. Whatever the case, the name Syd stuck with young Roger, and he began using both names interchangeably. His sister Rosemary, however, would say, quote, "He was never Syd at home. He would never have allowed it." Another interesting coincidence was that one of his teachers at Morley Memorial Junior School was the mother of his future bandmate, Roger Waters. He would then go on to attend high school at the Cambridgeshire High School for Boys with Waters. As the recently christened Syd aged into his early teens, he also became interested in the guitar, and when he was around 14 would acquire his first acoustic, a Hofner from the 50s, likely a model called the Congress. Just before Syd turned 16, the first personal tragedy of his young life would strike as his father would pass away due to cancer. This led Syd's mother to become his cheerleader in the hopes of allaying the young man's grief. She would often allow the myriad of bands that Syd had joined to play gigs in the family home's front room. The first of these was an outfit formed by Syd around lead singer Jeff Mott that he called the Mottos, and this band was a short-lived R&B cover group, but they would often cross paths with Roger Waters, who had a couple of years on Syd and was the chairman of his class's nuclear disarmament campaign. Even at a young age, Waters showed that he was not afraid to pursue political causes. Waters said in a recent interview that his activism came from his mother, who was always very political, and someone Waters considered a strong figure in his life. Syd would acquire his first electric guitar around 1961, a Selmer Futurama. This was the same model that would be picked up by George Harrison before the Beatles would visit Hamburg. And speaking of the Beatles, Syd would fall under their spell around 1963, when he was attending Cambridgeshire College of the Arts and Technology. It was at this school that Barrett would become close friends with David Gilmour, bound by their interest in the guitar and the same types of music. At the same time, Barrett began to rotate through Cambridge area R&B bands, and interestingly, he would switch to bass guitar for a time, joining bands such as Those Without and the Hollerin' Blues in 1963. Syd picked up a Hofner 505 bass guitar that is similar to the one that Roger Waters is seen playing sometime later, so it is possible that Barrett gave Waters this bass when he also switched over to the low end. Barrett also began writing songs around this time, inspired by the many British invasion bands who were writing their own hits in these days. He also followed the Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan, inspiring him to write the song Bob Dylan Blues, which would make an appearance on a compilation of Barrett's work in 2001. A friend also remembers hearing an early version of Syd's Effervescing Elephant around this time, which would make an appearance on Syd's first solo album many years later. Barrett and David Gilmour also were known to play acoustic gigs together in 1964, and they would even hitchhike and busk their way across the south of France at one point. But eventually, Barrett was forced to keep his options open by applying to study painting at the Camberwell College of Arts in London. He would move to London in the summer of 1964, and this is where his story really begins to take shape. As early as 1963, Roger Waters and drummer Nick Mason would meet while attending the London Polytechnic School on Regent Street. They would play in an early band called Sigma 6, which would undergo several lineup and name changes over the next year or so. The names in circulation were the Abdabs, the Screaming Abdabs, Leonard's Lodgers, named after the landlord of the flat in which Waters and Mason stayed. More on Leonard in a bit, the Spectrum 5, and the Megadeths. I wonder if Dave Mustaine knew about that one. Anyway, the band would eventually settle on the T-set for a time, and after some more revolving doors of musicians, Syd Barrett would move into Waters' flat, and the childhood friends would reconnect musically. Barrett joined the T-set in 1964, with the lineup at the time being Syd Barrett on guitar, Bob Close on lead guitar, who would soon depart after pressure to focus on his studies from his tutors and parents, Roger Waters on bass, Richard Wright on keyboards, and Nick Mason on drums. Singer Chris Dennis joined for a time before being deployed by the RAF to Bahrain. Once Close departed in mid-1965, Syd would step forward as the frontman of the band from that point forward. In late 1965, the T-set showed up to a gig and realized that there was, in fact, another band with the same name set to perform. Not happy with their current name anyway, Syd came up with a new name by mashing two blues musicians' names together, those of blues guitarist Pink Anderson and Floyd Council, initially using the monikers the Pink Floyd Sound or the Pink Floyd Blues Band. The group began to shape their early sound slowly over the course of the next year as they played shows. Eventually, they would be noticed at a gig at the famous Marquee Club by a lecturer at the London School of Economics named Peter Jenner, who was impressed by the sonic soundscapes that Barrett's guitars and Wright's keyboards created. Jenner and his business partner Andrew King would go all in on the Pink Floyd sound, buying the band about £1,000 worth of new equipment and setting up a management company called Black Hill Enterprises. It was at Jenner's urging that the band dropped the and the sound from their name, becoming, simply, Pink Floyd. It was probably at this time that Syd would acquire the guitar that would become his most famous axe, a 1962 Fender Esquire. Mike Leonard, the landlord who was mentioned above, had also become an integral part of the band's look, coming up with a light show, using colored lights and improvised liquid devices to project psychedelic images on the walls around the band. Inspired by this, Leonard helped Syd modify his new Esquire by wrapping it in a silver film and attaching small circular metal discs to it, which would reflect the light show and add to the freaky atmosphere created by Floyd's sonic soundscape. Syd developed a singular playing style which would include dissonant chords and electronic feedback. He was known to use a Zippo lighter to slide up and down the strings quickly, creating an eerie space-age type of sound. This was the time where the band started to truly build its early sound, utilizing long instrumental breaks and sonic dissonance to become one of the most notorious bands of the London Underground. Drummer Nick Mason said of this time in Floyd's development that it, quote, always felt to me that most of the ideas were emanating from Syd at the time. Along with the changes to Pink Floyd's look and sound, Syd Barrett also began a journey that would come to define his career and life to come. Barrett had begun to experiment with psychedelic drugs, like LSD, as early as 1965, with several trips ending badly. One trip ended with Barrett and a friend standing naked in a bathtub, reciting the term no rules, over and over. Barrett and his friends became obsessed with Sikhism and a sect called Sant Mat, but the sect's guru deemed Syd, quote, too emotional to join. Syd's friend Storm Thorgerson, who would go on to design album covers for many bands in the 60s and 70s as a member of Hypnosis, said that this was a deeply important moment in his life and that he was crushed by this decision. Psychedelic drugs became a constant companion in Syd Barrett's life from that point forward, and unfortunately is going to drive the rest of his story. As Pink Floyd's star began to shine more brightly throughout the London music scene, they would start to see more success and would become known as the star attraction of the psychedelic music genre that was growing in the mid-60s. Syd Barrett had elevated himself to the unquestioned leader of the group's sound and musical direction, and he began to borrow from his interests in fantasy novels and fairy tales, such as Grimm's and J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. He began to write more prodigiously, as well as shaping the band's live sound, which had become an amalgamation of rock, blues, and jazz, with extended, haunting instrumental breaks. In 1966, a new venue called the UFO, spelled UFO, opened in London, and Floyd became the house band, starting a residency. The band would meet American promoter Joe Boyd, who would go on to become instrumental in their future and their record deals. Pink Floyd would continue refining their sound through 1966 and 67, and some of the earliest recordings at Hemel Hempstead and St. John's Wood illustrated that although the band was known for long-winded improvisational breaks, they were still tight as a drum. English filmmaker Peter Whitehead, with whom Syd's girlfriend Jenny Spires was having an unknown affair, recorded the band for his 1967 documentary, Tonight, Let's All Make Love in London, and would say, quote, "They were just completely welded together, just like a jazz group." Barrett's performance in particular began to raise eyebrows, with biographer Nicholas Schaffner saying that they were, quote, "madness, improvisation, inspired to get past his limitations and into areas that were very interesting, which none of the others could do." Pink Floyd began to garner the attention of the record labels in 1967. Joe Boyd decided to create a bidding war between EMI and Polydor Records. In the end, EMI offered unlimited recording time for the band's first album, and so Pink Floyd ended up signing a deal with EMI, getting a £5,000 advance, equal to almost £100,000 today. EMI would release the band's first single, Arnold Lane, on its Columbia label on 10 March 1967. The single would promptly be banned on many radio stations due to the song's references to cross-dressing, but it would still manage number 20 on the UK charts, backed with Candy and a Currant Bun. However, the band saw more success a few months later with the release of their second single, See Emily Play, which got to number 5 on the charts. Pink Floyd would enter Abbey Road Studios between February and July of 1967 to record their first album, which put them in Studio 3 at the same time that the Beatles were working on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in Studio 2. Both bands would visit each other during the sessions, with Paul McCartney even professing a fandom of Floyd's early work. It should not be lost on us that the Beatles' own turn towards psychedelia at this time was inspired in part by the work of Pink Floyd and other acts like Hendrix, who were pushing the envelope of the sonic experience in those middle 60s in England. There is even an unfounded rumor that Syd participated in the recording of an unused Beatle number called What's the New Mary Jane? Unfounded. Piper at the Gates of Dawn was released on 5 August 1967, borrowing its name from a novel by Kenneth Grahame called The Wind in the Willows. It refers to the nature god Pan playing his pipes at dawn. But it was during the recording of this album that Syd's drug use and behavior began to markedly change. Former Beatles engineer Norman Smith had been tapped by EMI to produce the album, and he remembers trying to connect with the band on a musical level, playing jazz improvisations on the piano. But later he said, quote, "With Syd, I eventually realized I was wasting my time." Smith realized that Floyd's background as an improvisational, free-form band was at odds with making a marketable, structured pop album. Eventually, though, the band and Smith were able to come together to produce one of the most universally lauded albums of the year. Pink Floyd, it seemed, was on the cusp of superstardom, and it was then that the ground fell out from beneath their feet. Although many have speculated over the years that Syd Barrett's increasing erratic behavior and declining mental health was due to underlying conditions, Barrett's family have continually denied that he had any diagnosed mental illness. Syd's sister Rosemary did say, when asked whether she thought her brother had Asperger's syndrome, that all of the siblings were, quote, on the spectrum. This, coupled with a seemingly growing distaste for the music industry game around the time that Floyd signed their first record deal, there was a lot of factors that fed into Syd's decline. Considering that it is now impossible to diagnose Barrett with anything now that he is no longer with us, we won't try to. It's disrespectful to Barrett's family and memory to wildly speculate, so we will only talk about the issues he had with drug abuse. And those issues profoundly affected his ability to function and continue with Pink Floyd. Many have speculated that Syd was just playing a long, elaborate hoax on the band and the fans, since Barrett was already expressing a distaste for the music business and the constant meddling and revising of Pink Floyd's songs and sound. There was an element of paranoia in Syd's behavior, and it was clear that his almost steady diet of LSD didn't help matters. Sometime in 1967, Richard Wright remembered that Syd disappeared for a time that came to be known as his long weekend, and when he returned, he was not the same. Wright said, quote, "He went missing for the whole weekend, and when he appeared again on the Monday, he was a totally different person. When they found Syd, they told us, well, something's happened to Syd. Something had already happened to him. A total difference. He'd gone, still looking the same, but somewhere else. They said, something terrible has happened. He's like a zombie." Roger Waters also remembered, quote, "The shock of seeing him, such a change. Very frightening. I couldn't believe what had happened. Because he came the next day, and he was a different person." There's been much speculation as to what happened to Syd during this period. Conspiracy theories involving MK Ultra and other possibilities have floated around for years, but because none of them are provable or have hard evidence to point to, we can't really comment on them here. But what is known is that Syd hung out with a very unsavory cast of characters, and reports were that he was kept in a perpetual LSD trip for pretty much the entire time that he was away. Legendary photographer Mick Rock said that Syd's apartment was, quote, "a burned out place, the biggest hovel, the biggest shit heap, a total acid shell, the craziest flat in the world. There were so many people, it was like a railway station." Pink Floyd lighting man John Marsh also said that Syd lived at Cromwell Road with a cast of characters including a lunatic named Scotty, who he believed was keeping Syd in a perpetual state of acid trip. Marsh said, quote, "Everyone knew that if you went round to see Syd, never have a cup of tea, never take a glass of water unless you got it yourself from the tap, and even then, be desperately worried, because Scotty's thing was spiking everything." By this time, Syd was living on a diet that must have comprised 80% acid. Nick Mason remembered Syd in the early days as a clear extrovert, saying, quote, "In a period when everyone was being cool in a very adolescent, self-conscious way, Syd was unfashionably outgoing. My enduring memory of our first encounter is the fact that he bothered to come up and introduce himself to me." But now Barrett had become increasingly withdrawn and was experiencing hallucinations. His speech had become disjointed and nonsensical. He would forget who people were and went through periods of catatonia so deep that towards the end of his time in Floyd, Richard Wright remembered that he'd told Syd that he was going out to buy cigarettes when he was really going out to play a gig with the band. When he returned hours later, he found Syd sitting in the exact same position. Emerging from his catatonia, he asked Wright, quote, "Have you got the cigarettes?" Barrett's behavior at shows and appearances began to weigh on the rest of the band. Often at live shows, Barrett would stand in one spot, either strumming the same chord for the entire show or playing nothing at all. At a show at the Fillmore West, Barrett slowly detuned his guitar as the show went on. Pink Floyd appeared on several television shows during the American tour, and on Dick Clark's American Bandstand, he refused to move his mouth to mime to the pre-recorded performance, and gave quick, one-word answers to the later interview. This led to Floyd's management canceling the remainder of the US tour and bringing the band back to England, where they would be set up to support Jimi Hendrix and The Experience on their first UK tour. The return home did nothing to improve Syd's behavior, however. The remaining members of Pink Floyd knew that something had to change. At the same time, the band was on the cusp of success and fighting their creative leader's seemingly total mental breakdown. As the band continued to play live shows and began to think about recording a follow-up album, they knew that they needed a backup plan. For a short time, guitarist David O'List from The Nice would stand in when Barrett was unable to perform, but a longer-term solution would appear in the form of Syd's old friend from Cambridge and guitarist David Gilmour. Initially, the band had intended to carry on in a similar arrangement as the Beach Boys had, with Brian Wilson continuing to write and produce the band, but not to tour with them. Gilmour would be Barrett's backup on tours and appearances, simply a hired gun. But when the band began to gather songs for their second album to be called Saucerful of Secrets, they realized that Barrett's contributions would be minimal. A few of the songs had been recorded prior to the band leaving for their aforementioned US tour, including Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun and Jug Band Blues, but by January of 1968, the band had begun to move on from its expectations of Syd Barrett as a songwriter. During shows in January, Pink Floyd appeared briefly as a five-piece, with Gilmour playing guitar and Barrett wandering about the room, only occasionally playing with the band. During this time, the band began to run through songs that bassist Roger Waters had contributed, and there would be no more songs added to Floyd's second album that were penned by Syd Barrett. It was as if a brilliant young guitarist and songwriter had simply disappeared overnight. Syd continued to distance himself from the group, one time even waiting in the reception area of the studio to be invited in, and glaring at Gilmour at shows, despite still technically being a member of the band. But that would officially end on 6 April 1968, when Pink Floyd would announce that they and Syd were going their separate ways. After his departure from Pink Floyd, Syd Barrett disappeared from the public eye for over a year. One can only speculate the reasons why Syd changed so drastically in such a short period of time. He has not spoken at length about the breakup, but friends have pieced together several thoughts that were going through Barrett's mind at the time. Some of this can be chalked up to the paranoia from the LSD, but it seems that Barrett felt that the band was selling out after signing to EMI. He seemed increasingly disinterested with playing the rigid game of recording and live appearances that went along with the rock star lifestyle. Before his departure from Floyd, he introduced a song he called Have You Got It Yet?, which after several hours of attempts to get Barrett's ever-changing chord progressions, the rest realized that it was just an elaborate prank. Roger Waters remembered, quote, "I actually thought there was something rather brilliant about it, like some kind of clever comedy. But eventually I just said, 'Oh, I've got it now,' and walked away." This is the question Syd Barrett fans will always have regarding his departure from Pink Floyd. Was it due to a mental breakdown? Or was it disillusionment from the music industry? Perhaps a little of both? Despite his resentment, however, Barrett wasn't quite done with music. After he left Pink Floyd, longtime manager and partner Bruce Jenner left as well. And after a time, Jenner was able to convince Syd to return to the studio to begin work on his first solo effort to become the Madcap Laughs. But Jenner would say, quote, "I had seriously underestimated the difficulties of working with him." The sessions would be helped along by former Floyd bandmate David Gilmour on bass, as well as Gilmour's old Joker's Wild drummer Willie Wilson, and production help from Roger Waters. Gilmour would say of the sessions, quote, "They were pretty torturous and very rushed. We had very little time, particularly with the Madcap Laughs. Syd was very difficult. We got that very frustrated feeling. Look, it's your fucking career, mate. Why don't you get your finger out and do something?" The guy was in trouble and was a close friend for many years before then, so it really was the least one could do. Gilmour, Richard Wright, and Humble Pie drummer Jerry Shirley would rush into the studio to work on Barrett's second album through 1970 as well, with Wright remembering, quote, "Doing Syd's record was interesting but extremely difficult. Dave and Roger did the first one, and Dave and myself did the second one, but by then, it was just trying to help Syd any way we could, rather than worrying about getting the best guitar sound. You could forget about that. It was just going into the studio and trying to get him to sing." As a result of the haphazard and sporadic recordings on both albums, neither album made much of an impact on the charts. Drummer Shirley would say, quote, "He would never play the same tune twice. Sometimes Syd couldn't play anything that made sense. Other times what he'd play was absolute magic." An attempted solo show to promote the album would occur in June of 1970, backed by Gilmour on bass and Jerry Shirley on drums. But the performance was marred by a myriad of technical problems, and even though Barrett did try to perform this time, he would leave the stage after 4 songs due to the PA system's malfunction, causing his vocals to be near inaudible. Barrett's next attempt at music would be another ill-fated affair, but it started promisingly enough when he was pulled from the audience by American blues musician Eddie Guitar Burns to perform a 30-minute jam session with them. Syd returned the next night to perform several songs with the group, and this collaboration led to drummer Twink Adler and bassist Jack Monk asking Syd to form a group that they called Stars. After a few small but promising performances, the group was slated to play with proto-punk band MC5 at the Cambridge Corn Exchange. Unfortunately, the first performance was plagued again by sound problems, and Barrett again withdrew emotionally and mentally from the proceedings. And following a scathing review in Melody Maker magazine the next day, the band folded forever. Syd would drop in on his former Floyd bandmates from time to time, most notably in 1975 when the group was working on the album Wish You Were Here. Syd appeared overweight and had shaved off all of his hair, including his eyebrows, causing the band to initially not know who he was. He would sit in on the mixing of Shine On You Crazy Diamond, which was about him, and say when Waters asked what he thought of the song, quote, "Sounds a bit old." He also spent some time during the session brushing his teeth. Barrett would appear briefly on stage at a poetry reading by former Cream bassist Jack Bruce. Lyricist Pete Brown remembered that he arrived late and saw a guitarist playing with Bruce that he'd only vaguely remembered. Later, when Brown introduced a poem dedicated to Syd, he said, quote, "He's here in Cambridge, and he's one of the best songwriters in the country." Syd himself then stood up and said, quote, "No, I'm not." Throughout the next few years, Syd was known to stay at various hotels in London, eventually settling in the upscale Chelsea Cloisters apartment. Ronnie Salmon, a porter at the Chelsea, remembers Barrett simply gave or threw a shocking amount of goods away. He said, quote, "The stuff he used to throw away was unbelievable. One day from Harrods, they delivered a Dynatron TV. It was worth about £800. He had it for 2 days and then called me up and said, 'Ronnie, can you take this away?' I said, 'What do you want me to do with it, Syd?' He said, 'Take it, keep it.' I had a guitar off him, 2 Marshall amplifiers. The other porters got a bit jealous because he was giving me so much stuff." Eventually, though, the money would dry up and Barrett found himself almost homeless. He decided to return home to Cambridge to live with his mother, but rather than asking a friend for a ride or take a bus, Syd walked the entire 50 miles home. Barrett's sister Rosemary remembered, quote, "I was not surprised at the time about him walking. He was capable of anything. I do remember he had some huge blisters on his feet that took a while to heal." Despite Barrett's casual attitude towards money, leading to his return to his mother's, David Gilmour said that Barrett has received royalties up until his death in 2006, with Gilmour stating, quote, "I made sure the money got to him." The last time any member of Pink Floyd saw Syd Barrett comes from a recollection by Roger Waters, who said, "The last time I saw him was a couple years after he turned up at the Wish You Were Here sessions. I bumped into him at Harrods, where he used to go to buy sweets, but we didn't speak. He sort of scuttled away." Unwilling to push his former bandmate further, Waters decided it best to not attempt further communication. With that, Barrett would spend the rest of his life mostly in private. Barrett's return to Cambridge also saw a return to using his birth name again, Roger, forever. Essentially, the rock star Syd Barrett was killed in his mind. Barrett returned to painting, although few of his works survived to see the light of day. Barrett would take photographs of his completed works before burning the canvases. Most of what we know about this time come from his family, who believe that Barrett's reputation as a recluse is a bit of a misnomer. His brother Ian recalled, quote, "He used to take himself up to London on the train and visit art galleries, so this whole recluse thing is inaccurate." His sister Rosemary said, quote, "Roger may have been a bit selfish, or rather self-absorbed, but when people called him a recluse, they were really only projecting their own disappointment. He knew what they wanted, but he wasn't willing to give it to them." Indeed, Roger's family have repeatedly said that although Barrett underwent treatment for likely after effects of his LSD use, no formal mental illness treatment was ever considered appropriate by doctors. After a time, Roger Barrett began a simple life in his childhood home, slowly turning the house that he'd shared with his mother into a mishmash of eccentric designs and clashing colors. His sister said, quote, "The house, he wrecked. Every wall would be painted a different color. The idea of painting a room with the same color was just nonsensical to him. I used to say to him, 'Do 2 walls the same color?' 'But why?' he'd say. 'They're all different walls.' The house was very colorful, and anybody else would say it was a disaster, but that's how he liked it. We used to go to hardware stores, B&Q and Homebase, and go to all this wood endlessly and do lots of DIY projects, which were very funny. He used to laugh at them because they never worked at all. Doorknobs were replaced with toys. Floors were a calliope of styles and colors, and flimsy shelves hung from almost every wall. Years later, many of Barrett's childlike creations would be auctioned off for charity, netting over £121,000 for a local art scholarship fund. Barrett would continue to dedicate himself to art, taking up photography and gardening. Several attempts over the years were made to lure Barrett back into the limelight, attempts which he mostly rebuffed. Several reporters and writers would occasionally accost him in his home in Cambridge, but Barrett did not want to be reminded of his musical past. That was until 2001, when a BBC omnibus documentary was made about Barrett called Syd Barrett, Crazy Diamond. For some reason, Barrett decided to watch the special at his sister's house. Unbeknownst to Roger, his sister Rosemary had actually helped the producers in making the show.
She remembered, quote,
"I was very surprised that he did watch. He came down to watch it with me. He didn't enjoy it. He didn't like it. He didn't quite know what was going on, I don't think. He just said, it's very noisy. The music's very noisy." Although he enjoyed hearing See Emily play again and seeing his old mentor Mike Leonard, Barrett's sister Rosemary said, quote, "Another life, another person. He didn't enjoy it, no." One could say that Barrett actually died twice then. The death of his rock and roll persona Syd, which died upon leaving London, and the everyman Roger, who would pass away in 2006 from pancreatic cancer. In the final analysis of Barrett's life, we are left with far more questions than answers. Although his musical output with Pink Floyd was frustratingly short, he left behind a musical legacy and a list of those influenced by him that is staggeringly long. But none of those influences bore more fruit than the one he left on Roger Waters, who would go on to continue Barrett's experimentation into the sonic landscape, coupled with his ability to write radio-friendly tunes that propelled Pink Floyd into the upper echelons of the discussion as to which band is the greatest of all time. Most of Floyd's most iconic and seminal works were, if not directly based on Syd Barrett, at the very least, heavily influenced by his time in the band. So in a way, it was as if Syd Barrett left his artistic spirit behind on the band, while his body, unable or unwilling to submit to the trappings of the rock and roll lifestyle, lived a separate life of anonymity elsewhere. Call it mental illness, call it autism spectrum, call it a bad acid trip. I think we need to call it Syd Barrett just being himself. Was it a mental breakdown? Or was it a huge experiment in performance art and Syd's idea of a huge middle finger to the conformity of the music business? One would like to think that it was maybe a bit of all those things. But that secret went to the grave with Roger Keith Barrett. But that's another episode of Forgotten Fretmasters. As always, thanks so much for watching, and we really appreciate you sitting through this extra special edition. As always, please be sure to subscribe to the channel and make sure you drop a like on the video below so this gets spread far and wide through the rock and roll community. And as always, we will see you next time.